Welcome back to the Side Chat Podcast. This week we are going to talk about the Battle Midway. One of the reasons I'm doing this is I'm also going to put up some Dauntless gameplay, and I wanted to try and correlate these two events together. So the Battle Midway is the single most important battle that happened for the Pacific Theater for the US. And I wanted to real quickly run through a timeline of events that happened before the Battle Midway so you can get a idea of how badly the US was doing in that theater, and then how Midway just flipped everything on its head. So, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed. That's a pretty famous date in history, at least for US citizens. And on December 10th, Japan invaded the Philippines. They seized Guam. December 18th, Japan invaded Hong Kong. December 25th, the British surrendered Hong Kong. January 2nd of 1942, Japan captured Manila. January 16th was Burma. January 3rd was the invasion of Solomon Islands. February 8th was Singapore. February 26th, U.S. carrier Langley was sunk. February 27th, the largest U.S. warship in the Far East, the Houston, was sunk. April 9th, U.S. forces in Bataan surrendered. And then April 10th was the Bataan Death March, where 5,000 U.S. Marines and Army were killed because they had the Bataan Death March. They had to do this crazy 60-mile march in the blazing sun with no water. Then from the April 18th, you have the Doolittle Raid, which most of you have probably heard of, where the U.S.'s retaliation to Pearl Harbor was they sent B-25s off a flat top and struck Japan, and then they landed in China. And that was a huge, huge embarrassment to the Japanese Navy, because they basically kept saying, we own this theater, nothing can touch us. And then the homeland got bombed. And it wasn't so much that the B-25s inflicted any damage whatsoever, it was just a psychological thing. So Yamamoto was given orders to come up with a offensive, a response, and try to, pay back the U.S., try to rebuild the faith, I guess. But on May 7th, 8th, 1942, Japan landed its first defeat at Coral Sea. Coral Sea is important because it's the first time that a naval battle was fought strictly by aircraft from two different carriers. I don't believe the actual ships ever saw each other. And then you had the Lady Lex sunk, Lexington sunk at Coral Sea, and that was a very famous aircraft carrier to that point, kind of a U.S. flagship that was lost there. And you'll see in War Thunder, you'll see LEX on one of the carriers, or all of the carriers. That model's based off the Lexington. So that brings us to Midway on June 4th. So now that we kind of ran through that timeline, U.S. got its first win at Coral Sea, but they needed to really stop. The Japanese had this huge carrier group that was able to strike anywhere. The Japanese had a much bigger navy, and they were able to attack where and when they pleased under their own terms. Well, Midway was kind of a little bit further east of the entire Japanese defense line, and they thought this would be a great place. It should be easy to take, and then we could build an air base there and then strike out further. So not very many people there. The only time Midway's a tiny little dinky island. The U.S. still uses it once in a while for stuff. I know a commercial airliner landed there a few months ago. It's still operational, but tiny little island, two little islands next to each other. And so they pulled up to the island, and they thought this was going to be easy. But let's take a step back, and let's talk about how the U.S. knew this was coming. Kind of a plot twist. So the Japanese used something called JN-25, which was an encryption system. And the U.S., back at Pearl Harbor, this guy named Captain Joseph Rockford, I hope I said that name right, at this facility called HIPO, which is a radio interception office. They used all these little punch cards and math, essentially, to come up with a codex to figure out the Japanese encryption. And they broke it just in time. And they sent out some kind of counterintelligence, and they got that, okay, it's going to be Midway. They had the date. They knew it was going to be there. And they had all the details, and they gave it to Nimitz. And every other intelligence agency did not trust these guys. And Nimitz took to... this is where Nimitz was the hero. Nimitz said, I'm going to trust this information. I'm going to gamble everything. It was kind of like poker. He went all in on this information and dedicated the three of the last aircraft carriers to this ambush. So So the U.S. started steaming towards Midway. So, and then as we know, Yamamoto came with his 4 carriers to Midway in his group. So, 4:30 in the morning on, like I said, June 4th, the Japanese launched 108 planes up to attack the islands. Some of them were Zeros and some of them were bombers, and the idea was that they're going to bomb the Midway defenses and they were going to send in troops to secure and then make it a Japanese air base. What they didn't know was that 250 miles to the east was Nimitz and his carriers, and they were outside radar range. Both sides did have seaplanes up searching, but the Japanese really didn't expect to see any U.S. Navy ships there. A seaplane from Midway spotted the Japanese force at 5:30 in the morning, and Midway launched all of its planes, which was the most random group of planes that, most of them were, a lot of them were hand-me-downs that were worn out. The Army, Navy, and Marines all had planes there. One of the famous battles was Squadron 221 attacked the Zeros that were incoming, and they were basically decimated. And this was when the U.S. was like, oh man, we're going to need something better. It was 21 Buffaloes and 7 Wildcats. F4, F-3 Wildcats, and they didn't fare so well. Yeah, so 6:30 in the morning, they didn't stop the Japanese attack. So 6:30 in the morning, bombs hit Midway. The island just went up in fire. There was seaplane hangars going up. There was normal hangars going up. The oils, the barracks, the oil tanks were going up, and the island was burning. And Japan decided that they were going to need a second wave of bombs to attack Midway before they're going to send in their defenses. And I'm going to put up a bunch of pictures. And I know they're not the greatest quality, but there's little captions underneath them too. So I encourage you guys to look at those pictures. It's amazing that all these really old, they're kind of low quality, but really old pictures of the battle existed. I didn't know all these pictures were still around or even existed. So Midway did have some other counterattacks besides VF-22. They sent up 6 TBF-1 Avengers, which were brand new at the time, and 4 Army B-26s went up. Most of those were lost, and none of the bombs hit water. And there was also 15 B-17s that tried high-altitude bombing, which also didn't hit anything. So, as Japan saw, Midway was falling easily. They weren't taking very much losses. They were decimating the U.S. Air Forces. What can go wrong? Well, about this time, Japanese scout plane reported a Japanese scout plane saw one of the U.S. carriers. And that's where it all kind of went tits up for Japan. They had since they're going to do the second bombing on Midway, they kind of covered their flight deck full of bombs, and all the airplanes landed to get rearmed. And then they were like, oh, we're going to go kill those carriers now, because that's basically the whole idea of the Battle Midway for the Japanese, was to bait the 3 last American carriers out of hiding, and so Yamamoto could kill them, and then the war would pretty much be won for Japan right there. And so the priority automatically became kill those carriers. That's what they're there for. So they had bombs on the deck, they had fuel on the deck, they had airplanes everywhere, and then they had torpedoes on the deck. So just keep this in mind. Everything you want for a big bomb is on the deck. So the U.S. sent what was called and this is one of the saddest things in the world. I don't know if you can call this heroism. At 9:30 in the morning, the Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, I'm sure some of those names you've heard before, sent up 3 squadrons of TBD-1 Devastators. These are not in War Thunder right now. They really need to be added. This is one of those workhorse planes that have not been put in the game. The Devastator, there was nothing devastating about the Devastator. 41 planes attacked, 4 came back. And this is, I've heard different stories, and these things were, I've talked to Kobe, asked him about these planes a couple times, and he said that these planes could barely fly underneath their own power. These things were just out of date. It was the best U.S. had around, and they weren't very well armored, they weren't very fast, they couldn't climb, and they were just sitting ducks, and they had no fighter coverage when they went in. The pilots were told, make sure your life insurance is paid up, write your final letter to your families, we will deliver them, and good luck. 41 planes went out, only 4 came back. After this, there was only 39 of them left in service, and then they were, of course, all kind of thrown out of service before the Avenger. But still, 41 went out, 4 came back. That is just mind-boggling losses. But what those guys did, and it's sad, when I think about this is, you know, and I know pilots die for different countries, but this was basically a suicide mission, and they had to know it was a suicide mission without fighter cover to go up against 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. But what they did was that they disorganized the Japanese defense. All the Zeros had to dive low, and they had to kill these things, and then that used up their ammo and their fuel, and it disorganized their defensive perimeters, and they had to land again. So you had planes going up and off these Japanese carriers left and right trying to get fuel and ammo. And right about that point, this is where, right at this point of, you know, the Japanese are like, oh, the US just sent these devastators, we killed them, everything's going great. And Yamamoto and his fleet had no idea that of all planes, if you asked what plane is going to win the Pacific Theater, if you asked a normal person who did not know about Battle Midway, they might say the Corsair or the Hellcat or maybe the B-17, B-24, P-38, Aircobra. You could pick a lot of different planes that you would think would win this war. It was the little freaking Dauntless, of all things, that changed the Pacific Theater and ended this war pretty quickly. So they sent up 3 squadrons of Dauntlesses from 3 of the aircraft carriers, and they went super high altitude, and I believe they did have some fighter coverage up there, so that's why the fighters weren't down the Devastators. And I've heard a couple different stories, and the one that I've heard was, the one I believe, or at least the most detailed one I've heard, was from the actual squadron commander who was up there. They got lost, and they were supposed to attack when the Devastators were attacking, but they couldn't see through the clouds where the Japanese fleet was, and so they were kind of flying around in circles trying to find the Japanese, which actually worked out in their favor. But the big problem is that they were running low on fuel, and there's actually a point in the history where if he said, we're not going to find it, guys, let's go back to base and refuel, everything would have been lost there. All the Devastators would have died for nothing. The window for attack would have just been lost. But that squadron leader kept on and went past, you know, the point of basically almost no return with his fuel. And at the last possible minute, they saw a wake of a Japanese destroyer, and they knew it was that direction. They followed the Japanese destroyer that direction, and they found 3 of the 4 carriers. When they found that, all the Dauntlesses came down in synchronization and hit 3 of the 4. And like I said, the decks, those Japanese carriers at the time were unarmored decks. They were covered in bombs, fuel, and torpedoes. And the Akagi, Kaja, and Soru went up a fire. And there's going to be some pictures of those, of course. And they were just knocked out of the battle forever at that point. The 4th carrier, Hairu, was later found that day and was bombed itself. And it was damaged, burning, and then later abandoned. So Yamamoto lost all 4 carriers in a matter of, what, 12 hours? 6 hours? And it was forced to retreat. Now, what does this mean about, why is that so important? Okay, they lost only 4 ships. Well, they only had X amount of aircraft carriers. And I believe they only had 1 in production. So they lost 4. I believe that Japan only had 1 in actual dry dock being built, while the US still had 3 plus 6 being built. And then, as you know, the US pumped out things like the escort carrier and different classes of carriers like nonstop. And air superiority won that battle. Even though Japan still had a larger navy and they still had more battleships, when you have the carriers, that's how you won. That's how wars are fought. You know, from that point on, it was all about the carrier. So that is the most pivotal point in the Pacific Theater's point, I think, or at least I would agree, and I think a lot of historians agree. And so next time you see the Dauntless in your tech tree, if you didn't know about all this, you know, you might have a little more respect for that little bitty airplane. Like I said, I'll put up some gameplay of it, and I just wanted to make this podcast pretty short and sweet this week, and I thought, you know, this is definitely one of my favorite moments being a U.S. citizen, and I love U.S. Navy history. You know, and I'm very proud of the people who fought there and stopping Japanese. You know, Japanese just pushed through and invaded everybody at that point. And this was that moment, that lucky moment of, you know, that the U.S. cowboy Nimitz just putting it all in and stopping it. Like I said. So next week, I'm probably going to try and get a guest back on. And we'll try to do something a little bit more fun. But like I said, I wanted to tie this to the Dauntless footage. So thanks for listening. Real quick, I just want to share, because I've been told I need to do this. I do have a Facebook account for Bowtime. I will put that in the description. I also have a Twitter account for Bowtime, and I also have a live streaming Twitch account. So you guys can follow me on some other social media forums if you want to. No pressure, just putting it out there because a lot of people don't know about them. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next week.